Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following presentation is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws, historical interpretations, and demographic trends are complex and vary significantly across different jurisdictions and time periods. The information provided here is based on historical records and sociological data, and should not be used as a substitute for professional counsel. We strongly encourage all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified professionals regarding their specific legal, financial, or personal situations. In 1970, the state of California passed a piece of legislation that would fundamentally rewrite the social contract for every man in the United States. Before the ink was even dry on the Family Law Act, the American domestic landscape was a rigid, fault-based fortress. If you were a man seeking to exit a marriage, you had to prove a crime or a moral failure. Adultery, extreme cruelty, or willful desertion. But almost overnight, the legal barrier to exit vanished, and a demographic explosion followed that historians now refer to as the Great Divorce Boom. Within a single decade, the divorce rate doubled, and for the first time in American history, the divorced man transitioned from a social pariah living on the fringes of the community to a mainstream demographic powerhouse. We are currently looking at a historical trajectory where, for certain cohorts of men, the likelihood of remaining in a first marriage for a lifetime has become statistically lower than the likelihood of experiencing a legal dissolution. This shift was not an accident of culture. It was the result of massive legislative pivots, shifting economic incentives, and a radical transformation in how the American male identity is defined by the state. The problem we are solving today is the lack of historical context regarding why the modern male experience looks the way it does. Many men navigating the complexities of the current legal system or the dating market feel as though they are operating in a vacuum, unaware that the demographics of divorced men have followed very specific, predictable historical trends over the last 150 years. By the end of this deep dive, you will understand the precise mechanics of how we moved from the Victorian era of indissoluble unions to the modern era of the silver splitter. You will see how historical shifts in labor, such as the transition from agrarian to industrial economies, directly correlates with the rise of male divorce rates. This knowledge provides the essential framework for understanding potential outcomes in modern social structures and allows for a clearer view of the case studies that define our current era. To understand where we are, we must go back to the first comprehensive national data collection on marriage and divorce in 1867. During this era, the demographic of the divorced man was almost non-existent in the public record. In the mid-19th century, the divorce rate was roughly 0.3 per 1,000 people. If you were a man in 1870, your social standing was intrinsically tied to your status as a head of household. To be divorced was to be seen as a failure of leadership, or worse, a man of such poor character that a court of law had to intervene. The fault system meant that a man had to publicly litigate his private failures. If a man wanted a divorce, he often had to prove his wife had committed a specific offense, and conversely, if he was the one at fault, he faced significant financial and social ruin. This created a demographic of legally married, but socially separated men who would simply abandon their families and move west, a phenomenon known as the poor man's divorce. As we move into the early 20th century, specifically the post-World War I era, we see the first significant demographic spike. The 1920s introduced the new woman, and a changing economic landscape where men were no longer tied to family farms, but were working in urban factories. The demographic of divorced men began to shift from wealthy elites, who could afford the legal fees, to middle-class urbanites. By 1920, the divorce rate had climbed to 1.6 per 1,000. Historians note that this period saw a rise in what were called divorce colonies, such as Reno, Nevada, where men would travel to establish residency for a few weeks to take advantage of more lenient laws. This created a specific subdemographic, the Reno man, a transient figure who sought legal relief from the restrictive laws of his home state. This was the precursor to the modern mobility we see today, where men move across state lines to find more favorable legal environments. The most dramatic historical trend, however, occurred immediately following World War II. In 1946, the United States saw a massive surge in divorces that wouldn't be eclipsed for decades. Thousands of men returned from the front lines to find that the quick marriages they had entered into before shipping out were no longer sustainable. The demographic data from 1946 shows a rate of 4.3 per 1,000 people. These men were often young, dealing with the psychological aftermath of combat, and struggling to integrate into a domestic life that had moved on without them. This case study of the post-war era illustrates how external geopolitical shocks can fundamentally alter the stability of the male domestic experience. However, the 1950s provided a brief, deceptive lull. This was the era of the nuclear family, where divorce rates actually dipped and stabilized. For a man in 1955, the social pressure to remain married was at an all-time high. The demographic of divorced men during this time was often characterized by extreme social isolation. Corporate culture in the 1950s frequently penalized divorced men, viewing them as unstable or unreliable for high-level management positions. This era created a bottleneck effect. The pressures for divorce were building beneath the surface, but the legal and social costs remained too high for most men to act. This brings us back to the 1970s and the introduction of no-fault divorce. When Ronald Reagan signed that bill in California, he opened the floodgates for a new demographic reality. For the first time, a man did not need to prove his wife was an adulterer to leave, and a woman did not need to prove her husband was a brute to do the same. The irreconcilable differences clause changed the demographic profile of the divorced man from a litigant to a negotiator. Between 1960 and 1980, the number of divorced men in the U.S. labor force skyrocketed. This period also saw the rise of the tender years doctrine being challenged, leading to the early stages of the joint custody movement. By the 1980s and 1990s, we began to see the demographic of the divorced father emerge as a distinct political and social bloc. The historical trends here show a shift toward men seeking more active roles in their children's lives post-dissolution, which in turn influenced child support and custody legislation across the country. We also began to see the gray divorce phenomenon take root, where men in their 50s and 60s, after decades of marriage, were entering the divorce market. The data suggests that for these men, the potential outcomes often involved a significant drop in household income, but a different set of social opportunities compared to younger men. In the modern context, we are seeing a fascinating divergence in demographics. Today, the divorce rate for younger men is actually declining, largely because younger men are delaying marriage or opting for cohabitation. However, for men in the baby boomer and Gen X cohorts, the divorce rate remains historically high. This creates a unique demographic landscape where the divorced man is increasingly likely to be an older, established professional rather than a young man starting out. Understanding these historical cycles is crucial because it allows us to see that the current state of the American male is not a permanent fixture, but a fluid demographic shaped by nearly 2 centuries of legislative and economic evolution. By examining these case studies, we can better understand the potential outcomes for the next generation of American men. Imagine a man named John in the year 1900. John is a laborer in a rapidly industrializing Chicago. To the state and his community, John is not just an individual. He is the fundamental unit of social stability. If John's marriage is failing, he faces a demographic reality that is almost impossible to navigate by modern standards. In 1900, the legal hurdles for a man to exit a marriage were so high that most men in John's position did not even attempt a formal divorce. Instead, they engaged in what historians call the poor man's divorce. Desertion. Demographic records from the turn of the century show that for every one formal divorce granted to a man, there were likely 3 or more instances of simple abandonment. This creates our first major demographic case study. In the early 1900s, the divorced man was statistically likely to be a man of high socioeconomic status because only the wealthy could afford the legal fees, the private investigators, and the social fallout of a public fault-based trial. If you were a man of modest means, you didn't get a divorce. You simply disappeared. You moved 2 states over, changed your name, and started a new life. This led to a massive unrecorded demographic of phantom bachelors, men who were technically married but lived as single men. This historical trend highlights a crucial point. The recorded divorce rate of the early 20th century is a massive undercount of actual marital dissolution. For the modern man in 2026, the idea of having to move to a different state and change your identity just to end a relationship seems like a plot from a thriller, but for a significant portion of the male population in 1900, it was the only potential outcome for a failed union. Now let's look at the step-by-step evolution of how this demographic moved from the shadows into the legal sunlight. By the 1920s, a new phenomenon emerged. The Reno man imagined John again, but now it is 1927, and he has managed to accumulate some savings. He hears about a legal loophole in Nevada. The residency requirement there has just been slashed to 3 months. John boards a train, leaves his life in New York, and checks into a dude ranch in Reno. For 3 months, John is part of a transient demographic of men who are essentially divorce tourists. This was the first time in U.S. history that the legal system became a competitive market. States began competing for divorce business by lowering barriers. The demographic profile of the 1920s divorce man was someone who was urban, mobile, and increasingly middle class. This was the era where the social stigma began to crack, but only if you had the means to travel. The Reno man was a cultural icon, often depicted in the media as a bit of a rogue, a man who was literally buying his freedom. This created a two-tiered demographic: the wealthy men who used Nevada to bypass strict home state laws, and the working-class men who were still stuck with the poor man's divorce of desertion. This disparity is a critical historical trend because it shows that for much of American history, the ability to be a divorced man was a luxury good. The true demographic explosion, however, occurred in the wake of the 1946 spike. To understand this, we have to look at the case study of the Quickie War marriage. Imagine a young man named John in 1942. He is 19 years old, he has just finished basic training, and he is about to be shipped to the Pacific. In a whirlwind of patriotism and biological urgency, he marries a girl he has known for 3 weeks. 4 years later, in 1946, he returns a different person. He has seen the horrors of Iwo Jima. She has spent 4 years working in a munitions factory and gaining a level of independence her mother never dreamed of. The data from 1946 is staggering. The divorce rate hit 4.3 per 1,000 people, a record that would not be broken until the mid-1970s. This created a specific demographic of young, traumatized, and socially displaced men. These were the greatest generation men, but they were also the first generation to experience mass marital failure. This period is essential for our deep dive, because it proves that demographic shifts in divorce are often lagging indicators of massive geopolitical trauma. The 1946 man wasn't seeking a soul mate, he was seeking a return to a normalcy that no longer existed. When the domestic reality failed to meet the wartime fantasy, the demographic of divorced veterans became a significant social concern for the U.S. government, leading to early versions of marriage counseling and veteran support services. Then we enter the strange silent era of the 1950s. If we look at the demographics of men in 1955, the divorce rate actually appears to be in retreat. But this is where the imagine if scenario becomes vital for understanding the pressure. Imagine you are John in 1955. You work for a major corporation like IBM or Ford. You are on the track for a VP position. You have a house in the suburbs and 3 kids. If you get a divorce, your career is effectively over. In the 1950s, a man's marital status was seen as a proxy for his reliability as a corporate citizen. The demographic of divorced men in the 50s was small, but they were essentially corporate exiles. Case studies from HR departments in that era show that a divorce was often treated with the same severity as a criminal record. A man who couldn't manage his own household was deemed unfit to manage a department. This created a demographic of frozen marriages, men who lived in quiet desperation, remaining in high conflict or stagnant unions specifically to protect their professional standing. This historical trend is why, when the 1960s Cultural Revolution hit, the demographic shift was so violent. It was decades of suppressed marital dissatisfaction being released at once. Step by step, we can see how the company man of the 1950s was the pressure cooker that led to the no-fault man of the 1970s. In 1950, to get a divorce, John had to go through a fault trial. This wasn't a private negotiation, it was a public theater of shame. John would have to hire a private eye to take grainy photos of his wife in a hotel room, or he would have to admit to extreme cruelty in open court. This was the demographic of the shamed man. The legal system required a villain, and if John wanted out, he either had to cast his wife as the villain or accept the role himself. This public degradation is why the demographic of divorced men stayed so small for so long. The entry price was your reputation. As we approach the pivot point of 1970, the demographic shifts again. The no-fault revolution didn't just make it easier to leave, it changed who was leaving. Before 1970, divorce was often initiated by men who had found another partner and were willing to pay the reputation tax. After 1970, we see a massive rise in women initiating the process, which created a new demographic of surprised divorced men. Men who thought their marriages were fine enough, only to find themselves in a legal system that no longer required their consent for a dissolution. This brings us to the modern era of 2026. Today, the demographic of the divorced man is defined by what we call the silver tsunami. While younger men are divorcing less because they are marrying less, men over the age of 50 are divorcing at rates higher than any time in human history. Why is this happening? Why is the man who stayed married for 30 years suddenly becoming a statistic in 2026? To understand that, we have to look at the specific financial and psychological shifts that occurred when the pension era died and the individual 401k era began. But there is a darker side to this demographic shift. As we moved into the late 20th century, a new phenomenon began to emerge that would redefine the male experience in the family court system: the rise of the contested custody era. If the 1950s was about the reputation tax, the 1980s and 90s became about the parental tax. What happens when a man is no longer just losing a wife, but is fighting for the right to be a father? In the next part, we will deep dive into the 1984 joint custody revolution and how it created a demographic of weekend warriors, men who were legally redefined as visitors in their own children's lives. We will examine the step-by-step evolution of child support guidelines and how they transformed the demographic of the divorced man into the single largest source of revenue for many state social service agencies. Are you ready to see how the tender years doctrine was replaced by a system that many men claim is even more restrictive? And more importantly, how did the 2026 legal landscape finally start to respond to this demographic pressure? The answer lies in a case study from the mid-90s that changed everything. To understand how the 2026 legal landscape finally started to respond to this demographic pressure, we have to look back at the mid-90s, specifically 1996. This was the year the United States passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, a piece of legislation that fundamentally altered the financial and legal identity of the American divorced man. Before this point, child support was largely a localized, often haphazardly enforced matter handled at the county level. But the 1996 Act mandated that states create automated, centralized systems to track down non-custodial parents. This created a new massive demographic: the digitally tracked father. Imagine if you were a man named John in 1997. For the first time in history, your social security number was linked to a national database of new hires. If John moved from New York to California to start a new job, the state of New York would know within 30 days. This transition turned the divorced man into a primary focus of state administrative agencies. The demographic of divorced men was no longer just a collection of individuals. They became a vital revenue stream for state governments. This is because Title 4D of the Social Security Act provides federal incentive payments to states based on the amount of child support they collect. This historical trend created a system where the state had a direct financial interest in the demographic of the non-custodial parent, which statistically was over 80% male throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s. This leads us to a critical case study in the evolution of the visitor dad. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the prevailing legal standard was the best interests of the child. While this sounds noble, in practice it was highly subjective. For a man like John in 1992, best interests usually defaulted to the primary caretaker rule. Since the demographics of that era still largely involved a male breadwinner and a female stay-at-home or part-time working mother, the potential outcome for the man was almost always a 14-per-month visitation schedule, the every other weekend model. This created a demographic of men who felt like guests in their children's lives. They were financially responsible for the household they no longer lived in, while being restricted to roughly 15 to 20% of the parenting time. Step by step, this demographic of weekend warriors began to organize. By the early 2000s, we saw the rise of fathers' rights groups who used the emerging internet to share data and legal strategies. They pointed to a growing body of sociological research suggesting that children in the demographic of joint physical custody had better long-term outcomes than those in sole maternal custody households. This was a pivotal shift in the demographic narrative. Men were no longer just arguing for their rights as fathers, they were arguing for the needs of the children. This historical trend eventually led to the 2026 reality we see today, where over half of U.S. states have moved toward a presumption of equal shared parenting. Now, imagine John in the current year 2026. Unlike his grandfather in 1955 or his father in 1992, John's divorce starts with the legal assumption that he is an equal parent. The demographic of the 2026 divorced man is one that is increasingly home-centric. He isn't looking for a bachelor pad. He is looking for a 3-bedroom house in a good school district because he has his children 50% of the time. This has created a massive ripple effect in the U.S. economy. The demographic of divorced men is now a major driver in the real estate market for family-sized suburban rentals, and the consumer market for household goods, as these men are now essentially running a second full-time family household. However, the path to 2026 was paved with significant financial hurdles that defined the demographic for decades. We must analyze the step-by-step mechanics of the income shares model, which most states adopted by the early 2000s. In this model, the state looks at the combined income of both parents and then assigns a percentage of the cost to raise a child to the father. For many men, this resulted in a demographic reality where their effective tax rate, when you combine federal taxes, state taxes, and child support, could reach as high as 60 or 70% of their gross income. Case studies from this era show that this led to a phenomenon called involuntary career stagnation, where men would avoid promotions or raises because a significant portion of the increase would be absorbed by recalculated support payments. The 1996 welfare reform also introduced the license suspension trend. If John fell behind on his payments, the state could suspend his driver's license, his professional license, or even his passport. This created a demographic trap. A man could not drive to work because his license was suspended for not paying support, but he could not pay support because he could not drive to work. This specific historical trend contributed to a rise in the demographic of underground workers, men who worked for cash or in the gig economy, long before it was called that, simply to stay ahead of administrative enforcement. But there was another demographic shift happening simultaneously: the rise of the stay-at-home dad. By the 2010s, the demographics of the American workforce were changing. More women were out-earning their husbands. This led to the emergence of a new, smaller, but highly significant demographic: the man receiving alimony. In 2026, we are seeing the highest number of male spousal support recipients in U.S. history. This has flipped the traditional script and created new case studies for how the legal system handles gender-neutral laws that were originally designed with men as the sole earners. The psychological demographic of the divorced man has also evolved through these decades. In the 1970s, the divorced man was often portrayed as the swinging bachelor. By the 1990s, he was often the deadbeat. But by 2026, the demographic has shifted toward the disenfranchised griever. Modern data shows that divorced men are at a significantly higher risk for social isolation and health complications compared to divorced women. This is because, historically, men have relied on their wives to maintain their social circles and healthcare appointments. When the marriage ends, the demographic of divorced men often finds itself in a social vacuum. This brings us to a major open loop in the history of the American male. While the custody battles of the 90s and 2000s have largely transitioned into the shared parenting of 2026, a new demographic crisis has emerged. It's not about the children, it's about the hidden debt. As we move into Part 4, we are going to look at the gray divorce explosion and the demographic of men who are reaching retirement age only to find that their entire life savings are being divided in a 50-50 split that they never saw coming. What happens to a man who has worked 40 years for a pension, only to have it liquidated in 2026? How does the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO, work step by step to redistribute male wealth in the 21st century? The answer involves a specific change in the U.S. tax code that most men didn't notice until it was too late. We are going deep into the alimony cliff and the demographic of men who are essentially working until they die to cover the costs of a marriage that ended decades ago. Prepare yourself for the numbers in Part 4, because they will change how you look at the retirement dream. The retirement dream for the American man has undergone a radical demographic surgery since the late 20th century. To understand the financial identity of the divorced man in 2026, we have to examine the mechanism that dismantles 40 years of labor in a matter of months. This mechanism is the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. Imagine a man named John in 2026. John is 64 years old. He has spent 35 years as a middle manager at a logistics firm. He has a 401k valued at $1.2 million. In his mind, he is 18 months away from a quiet life of fishing and travel. But when his marriage of 30 years dissolves, John enters a demographic known as the silver splitters. Historically, the demographics of divorce were heavily weighted toward the young and the volatile. In the 1970s and 80s, if a couple made it past the 20-year mark, they were statistically likely to remain together until death. However, case studies from the last decade show that the divorce rate for U.S. adults aged 50 and older has roughly doubled since 1990. For those over 65, the rate has tripled. This has created a massive population of men like John who are facing a total financial recalibration at the exact moment their earning potential is peaking or beginning to decline. Let's look at the step-by-step process of how John's retirement is redistributed. First, the court must determine the marital portion of the retirement account. In most states, any contributions made and any interest earned from the date of the marriage to the date of the separation are considered community property. For John, who married right as he started his career, almost 100% of that $1.2 million is on the table. The second step is the valuation. This isn't just looking at a bank statement. It involves actuarial math to determine the present value of future pension payments or the projected growth of a 401k. Once the value is established, the QDRO is drafted. This is a specific legal document that instructs the plan administrator of John's logistics firm to split the account. This is where the demographic impact becomes permanent. The 401k is literally sliced in half. John is left with $600,000. At age 64, John no longer has the 3 decades of compounding interest required to turn that $600,000 back into a sustainable retirement fund. This historical trend has led to the rise of the working senior demographic. Data from 2026 shows a significant increase in men over 70 remaining in the workforce, not by choice, but because the potential outcomes of a late-life divorce left them with a 50% reduction in their expected standard of living. But the retirement account is only one side of the demographic shift. We must also look at the alimony cliff, which was fundamentally altered by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Before 2019, if a divorced man paid alimony, he could deduct those payments from his gross income for federal tax purposes. The recipient paid the taxes on that money. This created a social subsidy that made divorce slightly more affordable for the high-earning male. However, for all divorces finalized after January 1, 2019, that deduction vanished. Imagine John again in 2026. He is ordered to pay $4,000 a month in spousal support. Under the old rules, he would have effectively been paying that with pre-tax dollars. In 2026, he is paying that $4,000 with after-tax dollars. This means John has to earn roughly $6,000 to give his ex-wife $4,000. For the demographic of divorced men in the upper middle class, this change has resulted in a staggering drop in discretionary income. Case studies from 2026 suggest that this tax shift has extended the average male retirement age by nearly 5 years for those undergoing a late-life dissolution. This economic pressure has created a new demographic phenomenon, the multi-generational divorced household. In 1980, a divorced man in his 50s would typically live alone in an apartment. In 2026, we are seeing a historical trend where divorced men are increasingly moving back in with their elderly parents or, conversely, moving in with their adult children. The financial hit of a 50-50th split of the primary residence, coupled with the loss of half of the retirement assets and the lack of a tax deduction for support, has made independent living statistically more difficult for the divorced male. Furthermore, we have to analyze the demographic of the hidden debt. During the high inflation years of the early 2020s, many American households accumulated significant credit card and personal loan debt. When these marriages dissolve in 2026, that debt is also split. For a man like John, he might walk away with half the 401k but also half of a $50,000 credit card balance that was used to maintain a lifestyle he can no longer afford. This creates a demographic of men who are not just starting from zero, but starting from a negative net worth in their 60s. Step by step, the legal system in 2026 has become incredibly efficient at liquidating the male-held assets of the previous era. The transition from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution 401ks played a massive role in this. A pension was a stream of income that was difficult to value and even harder to divide without complex court orders. A 401k is a bucket of cash. It is liquid. It is visible. It is easily seized. This transparency has made the demographic of the divorced man more vulnerable to total asset depletion than at any other point in U.S. history. There is also the matter of Social Security. This is one of the few areas where the demographic data shows a potential for stability. If a man was married for more than 10 years, his ex-spouse can claim Social Security benefits based on his earning record without reducing his own monthly check. While this helps the ex-spouse, it does nothing to mitigate the man's loss of his private savings. The demographic of men relying solely on Social Security, because their private retirement was liquidated in a QDRO, is a growing segment of the American poverty map in 2026. Beyond the finances, the demographic of the silver splitter faces a unique health crisis. Historical trends show that married men live longer, have fewer heart attacks, and experience lower rates of cognitive decline than single or divorced men. When a man like John loses his marriage at 64, he doesn't just lose his 401k. He loses his primary health advocate. Data from 2026 indicates that divorced men in this age bracket have a 25% higher mortality rate over a 10-year period than their married counterparts. This isn't just about heartbreak. It's about the loss of the domestic infrastructure that manages diet, medication, and social engagement. The divorced man of 2026 is often a man who has played by the rules of the 20th century social contract, only to find the 21st century legal and tax codes have rewritten the terms of his exit. He is working longer, living in smaller spaces, and navigating a tax system that no longer recognizes his support payments as a business or personal expense. This leads us to a massive demographic divergence. While the older generation of men is being liquidated, the younger generation is watching. What happens to a culture when the young men of 2026 see the potential outcomes of John's life? This has triggered a complete collapse in the marriage rate for men under 30. We are entering the era of the opt-out demographic. In Part 5, we are going to look at the rise of the forever bachelor and the digital nomadic man. We will explore how the fear of the QDRO and the alimony cliff has created a new class of men who are intentionally keeping their assets offshore, in digital currencies, or in non-marital structures that the court of 2026 is still struggling to understand. But there is a new technology that is changing the game. How are AI-driven legal bots and blockchain-based prenuptial agreements starting to protect the assets of the next generation? And why are some states trying to ban these digital shields? The conflict between the traditional court system and the new digital male autonomy is about to explode. We are moving from the history of what happened to John to the future of what the modern man is doing to ensure it never happens to him. Follow us into Part 5, where we decode the algorithm of the modern male exit strategy. The observation of John's financial liquidation in 2026 has created a feedback loop that is currently transforming the demographic profile of the American male under the age of 35. If we look at the historical trends, we see that younger generations are the first in U.S. history to have a front-row seat to the systemic dissolution of their fathers' and grandfathers' assets through social media and real-time data sharing. This has led to the rise of what sociologists are now calling the opt-out demographic. Imagine a man named Liam in the year 2026. Liam is 28 years old, a software engineer with a high-income trajectory and a significant portfolio of digital assets. Unlike the generation of John, Liam does not view marriage as a mandatory social milestone. To Liam, the potential outcomes of a legal marriage in 2026 look less like a partnership and more like an unhedged financial liability. The demographic data for 2026 shows that for the first time in American history, more than 60% of men between the ages of 18 and 34 are single, and a growing percentage of them report having no intention of ever entering into a state-sanctioned marriage contract. This is not merely a social preference. It is a calculated response to the historical trends we analyzed in the previous parts. Liam has watched his Uncle John lose 50% of a 35-year retirement fund in a matter of months. Consequently, Liam and his peers are pioneering the algorithm of the modern male exit strategy, which is focused on prevention rather than litigation. Step by step, let us analyze how this demographic is insulating itself from the legal structures of the past century. The first pillar of this strategy is the shift from tangible to intangible assets. In the era of John, wealth was tied to a family home, a corporate pension, and a shared bank account. These are all easily identifiable and seizable assets in a 2026 divorce court. Liam, however, keeps a significant portion of his net worth in decentralized finance protocols and cold storage digital wallets. While these are still subject to disclosure in legal proceedings, the historical trend shows that they are significantly more difficult for a traditional court to value, freeze, or distribute without the cooperation of the owner. This has created a new demographic of the digitally autonomous man, who operates outside the traditional banking system that once served as the primary enforcement arm for domestic relations courts. The second pillar involves the rise of the blockchain prenuptial agreement. Imagine if a prenuptial agreement was not just a piece of paper that a judge could set aside based on a claim of unconscionability, but a self-executing smart contract. In 2026, we are seeing the early adoption of these digital shields. A smart contract can be programmed to release funds only under specific conditions, or to maintain a clear, immutable record of premarital asset growth that is separate from community property. While the U.S. legal system is still debating the enforceability of these contracts, Their mere existence has shifted the demographic narrative. Men are no longer relying on the state to protect their interests. They are using code to create their own domestic boundaries. This leads us to a critical case study: the rise of the forever bachelor. In 1960, a 40-year-old never-married man was a demographic anomaly, often viewed with suspicion or pity. In 2026, this man is part of an elite, growing demographic that controls a massive percentage of discretionary spending. This shift has massive implications for the U.S. economy. Historically, the American male was the primary consumer of family-oriented products: suburban houses, minivans, and life insurance policies. The 2026 opt-out man is instead driving the market for luxury single-occupancy real estate, high-end travel, and longevity-focused healthcare. He is a man who has decided that his financial and psychological health is best preserved through total autonomy. However, the state is not sitting idly by as this demographic shifts. We must examine the step-by-step reaction of the legal system to the opt-out movement. In 2026, several states have attempted to expand the definition of common-law marriage to include long-term cohabitation, specifically to capture the assets of men like Liam who avoid formal marriage. This has created a secondary historical trend: the geographic arbitrage. Just as men in the 1920s went to Reno for a divorce, men in 2026 are moving to states with strict no common law statutes, or even moving their primary residency to international jurisdictions with more favorable asset protection laws. This is the birth of the sovereign male demographic, men who are choosing their residency based on the risk profile of the local family court system. Let us look at another scenario. Imagine Liam enters a long-term relationship but refuses to cohabitate. This has led to the rise of the LAT demographic, living apart together. Historically, this was reserved for the eccentric or the wealthy, but in 2026, it has become a mainstream strategy for men to maintain their domestic sovereignty. By maintaining separate households, men like Liam are ensuring that there is no commingling of assets, no shared domestic life that a court could interpret as a de facto marriage, and most importantly, no loss of their personal sanctuary. This is a radical departure from the nuclear family model of the 1950s and highlights the demographic fragmentation of the American male experience. Furthermore, we must address the role of AI-driven legal bots in this new landscape. In the previous parts, we saw how the high cost of legal representation was a barrier for men like John. In 2026, AI tools can now analyze thousands of pages of case law in seconds to provide men with a precise risk assessment before they even enter a relationship. Liam can use an AI bot to draft a cohabitation agreement that is specifically tailored to the latest rulings in his jurisdiction. This democratized access to high-level legal strategy has shifted the power dynamic in domestic negotiations. The demographic of the uninformed man is being replaced by the demographic of the strategically prepared man. This technological shield, however, has triggered a massive conflict. Traditional legal institutions are lobbying for regulations to ban or limit AI legal assistance, claiming it constitutes the unauthorized practice of law. But the demographic momentum is behind the technology. Men in 2026 are increasingly choosing digital guidance over expensive human attorneys who they feel have a vested interest in prolonged, expensive litigation. This historical trend is leading toward a future where the traditional family court system may become obsolete for a large segment of the population, replaced by private arbitration and digital contracts. As we look at the broader picture, the demographic of the American divorced man is being replaced by a demographic of men who are simply undivorceable because they are unmarriageable under the current legal framework. This is not a strike in the traditional sense, but an evolutionary adaptation to a legal environment that many men perceive as hostile to their long-term stability. The potential outcomes of this shift are profound, affecting everything from birth rates to the long-term solvency of the Social Security system, which relies on stable family units to produce the next generation of taxpayers. But what happens when these autonomous men decide they still want to be fathers? How does the demographic of the solo father by choice fit into the 2026 landscape? We are seeing a rise in men using surrogacy and private legal contracts to build families without a spouse, bypassing the divorce risk entirely. This is the final frontier of male domestic autonomy. In Part 6, we are going to dive into the rise of the solo parent male and the legal battles over the definition of fatherhood in a world without traditional marriage. We will explore the case studies of men who are literally engineering their own families to ensure that the tragedy of John never becomes their reality. Is the nuclear family being replaced by the modular family? The data from the 2026 census suggests that the answer is already here, and it is more controversial than you think. Prepare for Part 6, where we look at the end of the traditional fatherhood model and the birth of the new domestic contract. The shift from the nuclear family to the modular family is not a distant prediction. It is the active reality for the American male demographic in 2026. To understand the birth of the new domestic contract, we have to look at the intersection of reproductive technology and asset protection. Imagine a man named Liam in 2026. Liam is successful, stable, and deeply desires to be a father. However, he has spent his entire adult life watching the demographic of the divorced man get hollowed out by the legacy legal systems we discussed in previous parts. For Liam, the traditional route to fatherhood, marriage followed by natural conception, carries a statistical risk he is no longer willing to accept. Instead, Liam represents a burgeoning demographic, the solo father by choice. Historically, the demographic of the single father was almost exclusively a result of either widowhood or the aftermath of a contentious divorce where the mother was deemed unfit or absent. In the 1980s, only about 10% of single-parent households were headed by men. By 2026, that number has surged, but the composition has changed. A significant portion of these men are not divorced. They are men who have utilized gestational surrogacy and ironclad legal frameworks to become parents without ever entering into a state-sanctioned marriage. This is the ultimate expression of the new domestic contract. It is a system built on intent rather than biology or traditional vows. Let us look at the step-by-step mechanics of how this demographic bypasses the divorce risk entirely. First, there is the legal navigation of parental intent. In 2026, several U.S. states have passed the Uniform Parentage Act or similar statutes that prioritize the intent of the intended parent over the biological connection to a surrogate. For a man like Liam, this means he can establish legal paternity before the child is even born. Unlike the divorced man of 1992 who had to fight a decade-long battle for 50-50 custody, Liam starts his journey as the 100% legal guardian with no competing claims. This historical trend represents a radical shift in the power dynamic of the American family unit. The state, which previously acted as a referee in the dissolution of a marriage, now acts as a witness to a private, commercial, and medical contract. The financial profile of this demographic is also distinct. While the cost of surrogacy in 2026 can range from $150,000 to $250,000, Liam views this as a predictable, one-time capital expenditure. Compare this to the potential outcomes for John, who we followed in Part 4. John lost $600,000 from his retirement fund, paid $4,000 a month in alimony, and spent another $100,000 on legal fees over 3 years. For the high-earning male demographic of 2026, the math is clear. The high upfront cost of a modular family is significantly lower than the potential long-term liability of a traditional one. This is how the divorce tax on fatherhood is being engineered out of the male experience. However, the rise of the modular family has triggered a massive legal and ethical backlash that defines the current demographic conflict. We are seeing a historical trend where traditionalists and certain state legislatures are attempting to restrict the new domestic contract. The case study of the 2025 Florida parentage dispute highlights this perfectly. A group of advocates argued that a child has a fundamental right to a dual-gendered household, attempting to use the state's police power to prioritize traditional marriage over contractual parenting. The outcome of these cases is shaping the map of the United States. Men like Liam are now performing a version of reproductive residency, moving to states like California, Nevada, or Connecticut where the legal infrastructure for the new domestic contract is most robust. Beyond surrogacy, there is the demographic of the co-parenting contract. Imagine two individuals, Liam and a female colleague named Sarah. They have no romantic interest in each other, but both want to be parents. In 2026, they enter into a detailed 50-page co-parenting agreement. This is not a marriage. It is a business partnership for the purpose of child-rearing. They maintain separate residences, separate finances, and use a private arbitrator to resolve disputes rather than a family court judge. This historical trend is creating a demographic of professional parents who treat the upbringing of a child with the same precision and accountability as a high-stakes corporate project. This removes the emotional volatility that typically fuels the divorce rates we saw in the 1970s and 80s. Step by step, these men are redefining what it means to be a head of household. In the 1950s, the demographic of the head of household was a man who provided for a wife and children in exchange for domestic stability. In 2026, the head of household is increasingly a man who manages a network of professional services, nannies, surrogates, legal advisors, and co-parents, to achieve the same goal without the risk of asset liquidation. This is the modular family in action. It is flexible, it is scalable, and it is shielded from the QDRO and the alimony cliff. But what does this mean for the children? The demographic data from 2026 is starting to provide the first look at the outcomes for children raised in these modular systems. Contrary to the warnings of the 1990s, early case studies suggest that children in these high-intent, high-resource households often have access to more educational and financial opportunities than children in high-conflict divorced households. The stability of the modular family comes from the absence of the legal threat of dissolution. Since there was no marriage to begin with, there is no divorce to tear the domestic structure apart. This realization is fueling the next wave of the opt-out demographic. Yet, this shift has created a new kind of isolation. As we move away from the traditional family model, the social support networks for men are changing. In the previous parts, we noted that the demographic of the divorced man often suffered from a loss of social advocate when his wife left. For the solo father or the co-parenting man of 2026, that advocate never existed in the first place. This has led to the rise of male parenting tribes, digital and physical communities where men in the new domestic contract share resources and support. This is the birth of a new male sociality, one built on shared parental responsibility rather than shared recreational interests. As we look at the historical trajectory from 1867 to 2026, we see a clear move from the indissoluble union to the contractual unit. The demographic of the American man has evolved from a man who was legally bound to his family, to a man who was legally punished for leaving his family, to a man who is now legally avoiding the traditional family structure altogether to protect his fatherhood and his future. This is the endgame of the 2-century-long evolution of U.S. divorce law. By making the exit so costly, the legal system inadvertently made the entrance unappealing. But there is a final psychological hurdle that the 2026 man hasn't yet conquered. While Liam has protected his 401k and secured his parental rights, he is part of the loneliest demographic in U.S. history. The modular life is efficient, but is it sustainable for the human spirit? As we move into Part 7, we are going to explore the social isolation epidemic among non-traditional and divorced men. We will look at the alarming data regarding the friendship recession, and how the demographic of the autonomous man is struggling with a crisis of meaning that no smart contract can solve. What happens when you win the legal war but lose the social connection? We are going to dive into the third place crisis, and how the 2026 male demographic is attempting to rebuild community in a world where the front porch has been replaced by a digital screen. The answer involves a new kind of men's shed movement that is sweeping across the United States. Are you ready to see the cost of autonomy? Part 7 will expose the hidden price tag of the new domestic contract. The hidden price tag of the new domestic contract is a phenomenon that sociologists are now calling the social asset liquidation. While men like Liam and Marcus in 2026 have successfully shielded their financial capital from the traditional family court system, they are discovering that social capital does not follow the same rules of asset protection. To understand the demographic of the isolated American man, we have to look at the historical trend of the wife as the social director. For nearly a century, the demographic of married men in the United States relied on a domestic partner to curate their social lives, maintain extended family ties, and manage the logistics of community engagement. When that structure is removed, either through a modern modular arrangement or a traditional silver divorce, the man often finds himself in a social vacuum that he is biologically and culturally ill-equipped to fill. Consider the demographic data comparing 1990 to 2026. In 1990, roughly 55% of American men reported having at least 5 close friends. By 2026, that number has collapsed to less than 15%. This is the friendship recession, and it hits the demographic of divorced and autonomous men with particular ferocity. Imagine a man named Marcus in the year 2026. Marcus is 42 years old and a high-performing project manager. He followed the new playbook. He has a clean co-parenting agreement, his 401k is untouched, and he lives in a high-tech condo that he owns outright. On paper, Marcus has won. But Marcus is also part of a demographic that is statistically likely to go 7 consecutive days without a meaningful face-to-face conversation with another adult outside of a professional setting. This isolation is not just a personal tragedy. It is a public health crisis with a specific demographic profile. Historical trends show that for men, Loneliness is as physiologically damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The demographic of the isolated 2026 man shows significantly higher levels of cortisol and a 30% increased risk of cardiovascular events compared to his married or socially integrated counterparts. Step by step, the loss of a domestic partner often leads to a phenomenon called the narrowing of the funnel. First, the man loses the social connections that were tied directly to his ex-spouse or co-parent. Second, he loses the shared social circle of other married couples who often feel awkward navigating the new dynamic. Finally, he retreats into a digital surrogate, online forums, gaming, or social media, which provides the illusion of connection without the biological benefits of physical presence. The historical context of this shift is vital. In the early to mid-20th century, the American man had a robust network of third places. These were social environments that were neither work nor home. Think of the Elks Lodge, the Freemasons, bowling leagues, or even the neighborhood tavern of the 1950s. For the divorced man of 1955, these institutions provided a soft landing. They were masculine spaces where social status was based on tenure and contribution, rather than marital status. However, the demographic data shows a steady decline in participation in these civic organizations starting in the late 1970s, coinciding with the rise of the Great Divorce boom. By 2026, the third place has been largely hollowed out, leaving the modern divorced man with nowhere to go but the gym or the office. This brings us to the rise of the men's shed movement as a direct demographic response to this crisis. Originally started in Australia, this movement has seen a massive explosion across the United States in 2026. A men's shed is a community-based, non-commercial organization that provides a safe and friendly environment where men can work on meaningful projects at their own pace in the company of other men. The demographic of men frequenting these sheds in 2026 is largely composed of silver splitters and opt-out men who are seeking a way to rebuild their social assets. The genius of the men's shed model lies in the shoulder-to-shoulder communication style. Historical trends in male psychology show that while women often bond face-to-face through direct emotional disclosure, men bond shoulder-to-shoulder while working toward a common goal. Imagine Marcus again. He joins a men's shed in 2026. He isn't there to talk about his divorce or his co-parenting challenges. He is there to help restore a 1968 Mustang or build furniture for a local shelter. But in the process of sanding wood or turning wrenches, the social liquidation begins to reverse. Marcus finds a demographic of peers who understand the specific pressures of the 2026 legal and social landscape without the need for a formal support group. This is the rebuilding of the masculine third place, and it is becoming a critical component of the new domestic contract. If you want the autonomy of the modular family, you must find a way to replace the social infrastructure of the traditional one. However, the scale of the isolation epidemic is still outpacing the growth of these sheds. We must look at the demographic of the digital hermit. In 2026, a significant percentage of divorced men are choosing to live in what are called smart enclaves, apartments designed for single occupancy with integrated AI assistants that manage everything from grocery delivery to health monitoring. While these technologies mitigate the practical difficulties of living alone, they often exacerbate the social isolation. Case studies from 2026 show that men who rely heavily on AI companionship report lower levels of acute loneliness, but higher levels of chronic existential dread. They have solved the problem of the empty house, but they haven't solved the problem of the empty life. Furthermore, we have to analyze the impact of the friendship recession on the labor market. The demographic of isolated men is increasingly prone to burnout. Without a domestic or social buffer to decompress, these men often treat work as their only source of identity and connection. This leads to a historical trend of high-intensity work cycles followed by total psychological collapse. In 2026, U.S. corporations are beginning to recognize that the demographic of the divorced, high-earning male is one of their most productive but also most fragile assets. Some companies have even begun to subsidize memberships to social clubs or men's sheds as part of their mental health benefits, recognizing that a man with no friends is a man with a high risk of professional attrition. The potential outcomes for the next decade depend entirely on whether the American male can successfully pivot from a domestic-reliant social model to an autonomous communal model. The demographic of 2026 is at a crossroads. They have the legal tools to protect their wealth and the reproductive tools to secure their legacy, but they are still searching for the tools to sustain their humanity. The new domestic contract is a brilliant piece of legal engineering, but it is a cold house to live in without a tribe. As we move toward the end of our deep dive, we have to ask, what happens when this demographic of autonomous, wealthy, but socially isolated men begins to exert its political will? We have seen how the legal system responded to the pressures of the 1970s and the 1990s. Now, in 2026, a new political bloc is forming. It is the bloc of the disenfranchised earner. They are tired of the tax code, they are tired of the family court legacy, and they are starting to demand a total overhaul of the American social contract. In Part 8, we are going to look at the rise of the divorce lobby and the 2026 legislative rebellion. We will explore how men are organizing to end permanent alimony once and for all, and how they are pushing for a national 50-50 custody mandate. But there is a counter-movement rising from the other side that is just as powerful. The battle for the future of the American family is moving from the living room to the floor of the Senate. Are you ready to see the bill that could end the divorce industry as we know it? The 2026 Family Fairness Act is about to be introduced, and the data suggests it will change the demographics of American men forever. Turn the page to Part 8 because the political war is just getting started. The political war is no longer a collection of isolated boardroom disputes or private legal battles. By 2026, it has transformed into a coordinated national movement known as the legislative rebellion. To understand the demographic of the American man in 2026, you have to realize that the Johns, Marcuses, and Liams we have tracked through this deep dive have stopped acting as individual victims and started acting as a unified political bloc. This is the rise of the disenfranchised earner, a demographic of men who have finally realized that while individual litigation in a family court is a losing game, collective legislative action is a potential outcome that changes the rules of the game itself. Historically, men have been slow to organize around domestic issues, often viewing their personal divorce as a private failure or a source of shame. However, the data from the early 2020s showed a radical shift in male social behavior. As digital communities matured and data regarding the financial and psychological toll of the family court system became more transparent, men began funding political action committees specifically designed to target the two most powerful pillars of the divorce industry: state legislators and family court judges. Imagine a man named David in the year 2026. David is 48 years old, a senior sales director for a medical device company in Ohio. David has been married for 23 years and is entering a dissolution process. Under the legacy system of 2010 or even 2020, David's demographic profile would have been the indentured bachelor. He would have likely faced a lifetime alimony award based on the long duration of his marriage, and despite his desire to be an active father, he would have had to fight a 3-year legal battle to prove that he deserved more than every other weekend with his teenagers. But David is the first generation to be covered by the proposed Family Fairness Act of 2026. This act is the crown jewel of the legislative rebellion, and its aim is to replace the subjective, high-conflict model of the past with a mathematical, low-conflict model for the future. The Family Fairness Act seeks to standardize 3 critical pillars of the male domestic experience that have historically been left to the broad and often unpredictable discretion of individual judges. The first pillar is the national 50-50 custody presumption. Historically, the demographic of the divorced man has been defined by his status as a visitor. The best interests of the child standard was so vague that it allowed for systemic bias, effectively relegating millions of men to secondary status. The 2026 Act proposes that unless there is clear and convincing evidence of child abuse or neglect, the court must start with the assumption that exactly equal parenting time is the only acceptable starting point. For David, this changes the entire demographic trajectory of his post-divorce life. He is no longer a guest in his children's lives. He is a parent whose time is protected by federal mandate. This historical trend is moving the American family from a winner-take-all model to a cooperative management model. The second pillar of the 2026 Act is the elimination of permanent alimony. To understand the impact of this, we have to look at the case studies of men from the 1990s who are still paying spousal support in 2026 for marriages that lasted half as long as the support duration. The legislative rebellion argues that in an era where women comprise over 50% of the workforce and earn more than men in many urban centers, the concept of lifetime support is a historical relic. The 2026 Act proposes a transitional support model, where alimony is strictly capped at 25% of the marriage's duration, and is designed solely to allow for vocational retraining. For a man like David, this means the difference between a lifetime of financial stagnation and a predictable 5-year window of support that allows both parties to move toward total independence. This shift is recalibrating the demographic profile of the middle-aged divorced man from a wealth transfer mechanism back to an autonomous economic actor. The third pillar, and perhaps the most controversial, is legal fee transparency and caps. The divorce industry in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar machine that thrives on conflict. Historically, the demographic of the divorced man has been the primary funder of this industry, as high earners are often ordered to pay not only their own legal fees but also the fees of their spouse. This creates a moral hazard where there is no incentive for the other side to settle. The 2026 Family Fairness Act proposes a cap on legal fees based on a percentage of the total marital estate. Imagine if David's divorce fees were capped at 5% of his total assets. This would effectively end the practice of scorched earth litigation. By removing the profit motive from the conflict, the act aims to move divorce from the courtroom to the spreadsheet. However, the historical trends show that the divorce lobby, a powerful coalition of the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers and forensic accounting firms, is fighting this rebellion with unprecedented ferocity. Their counterargument is that one-size-fits-all legislation ignores the nuances of complex family dynamics, and that the 50-50 presumption could inadvertently put children in high-conflict situations. This political war has created a demographic divide in the 2026 electorate. We are seeing the rise of the single-issue male voter. These are men who have moved past traditional partisan lines and are voting strictly for candidates who support the reform of Title IV-D and the implementation of the Family Fairness Act. Step by step, the legislative rebellion is utilizing the data gathered from 2 decades of the fatherhood movement. They are presenting congressional subcommittees with the correlation between lack of paternal access and the rise in male suicide rates, incarceration rates for fatherless children, and the long-term insolvency of the Social Security system as birth rates plummet. The argument is no longer about men's rights in a vacuum. It is about national stability. The demographic of the 2026 man is framing his autonomy as a prerequisite for a functioning society. If men believe the domestic contract is a trap, they will stop signing it. If they stop signing it, the demographic replacement rate of the nation fails. This leads us to a massive realization in 2026. The political war isn't just about money. It's about the survival of the marital institution itself. As the 2026 Family Fairness Act gains traction, we are seeing a historical trend of strategic filings. Thousands of men who were on the fence about divorce are waiting for the act to pass before they file, while thousands of spouses are rushing to file before the legacy laws are repealed. This has created a litigation logjam in the U.S. court system that is forcing the government to consider the very thing the rebellion wants: a simplified, administrative exit strategy that bypasses the lawyers entirely. But what happens if the bill fails? What happens to the demographic of men like David if the political war results in a stalemate? The data suggests that we are looking at the potential outcome of a nuptial strike. If the law won't change, the behavior will. We are seeing the early stages of men refusing to enter into any legal contract that doesn't include a sunset clause or a digital asset shield that the state cannot pierce. As we move into Part 9, we are going to explore the end of romance. We will look at the demographic of men who have won the political battle, but are now facing a world where marriage has been stripped of its soulmate mythology and reduced to a cold, high-performance utility contract. If marriage is just a business in 2026, how do men find meaning? And what is the new engagement model that is replacing the diamond ring with a blockchain-verified asset disclosure? The transition from I do to I agree to the terms and conditions is the final psychological frontier. In Part 9, we look at the rise of the utility marriage and the demographic of the emotionally audited man. Are you ready to see how the demographic of the 2026 male is finally separating love from law? The answer is more clinical than you can imagine. The separation of love from law is the final stage of the demographic evolution we have tracked from the Victorian era to the high-stakes digital landscape of today. In 2026, the American man has reached a point of psychological peak optimization. He has seen the data, he has witnessed the historical trends of asset liquidation, and he has concluded that the romantic blindness that defined his ancestors is a luxury he can no longer afford. This has given birth to the demographic of the emotionally audited man. This is a man who treats his domestic life with the same level of due diligence as a corporate merger. To understand this shift, we must look at the rise of the utility marriage, a domestic structure that is slowly replacing the legacy model of the 20th century. Imagine a man named Michael in the year 2026. Michael is 32 years old, a successful biotech researcher with a significant portfolio of intellectual property and digital currency. Michael has been in a relationship with Sarah for 3 years. In the year 1996, the next step would have been a diamond ring, a church wedding, and a legal contract signed in the heat of a romantic high, a contract whose terms were written by the state, not by Michael. In 2026, Michael follows a different protocol. Before any talk of a shared future, Michael initiates a digital asset disclosure and a reproductive intent audit. This is not seen as an insult. It is seen as a prerequisite for a stable, high-performance union. Historically, the demographic of men entering marriage did so under a veil of financial and legal ignorance. They believed that love would act as a buffer against the harsh realities of the family court system. The case studies of the early 2020s, however, proved that love is a volatile variable, while the law is a constant force. As a result, Michael and his peers in 2026 use a step-by-step verification process that strips the romance from the legalities. This is the new engagement model. Instead of an engagement party, Michael and Sarah host a contract review session with their respective legal AI bots. They negotiate the sunset clause, a provision that automatically dissolves the legal marriage after 10 years unless both parties opt in to a renewal. This ensures that the demographic of the silver splitter, which we saw in Part 4, is engineered out of their future. If the relationship ends, it ends on pre-negotiated terms that protect both parties from the QDRO and the alimony cliff. This clinical approach is reflected in the 2026 demographic data. For the first time, we are seeing a rise in marriage rates among high-earning men, but it is a specific type of marriage. Over 45% of new unions in 2026 involve a private domestic contract that supersedes the state's default divorce laws. These men are not opting out of commitment, they are opting out of the state's version of commitment. This is the demographic of the protected partner. They are choosing utility over mythology. They see marriage as a tool for tax optimization, reproductive stability, and shared overhead, rather than a spiritual bond that grants the state total control over their assets. The potential outcomes for this shift are profound. By separating love from law, the 2026 man is effectively reducing the volatility of the divorce market. When a utility marriage ends, there is no shock, no litigation, and no multi-year battle for custody. The case study of the 2025 New York arbitration wave shows that when men use these high-precision contracts, the average time to resolve a dissolution drops from 18 months to 14 days. This allows the demographic of the divorced man to remain productive and socially integrated, rather than falling into the spiral of isolation and debt that defined the previous decades. But what does it mean to be emotionally audited? It means that in 2026, the American man is constantly measuring the return on investment of his domestic life. Historical trends show that men are now using wearable technology to track their stress levels, sleep quality, and cortisol markers within the home. If the data shows that a relationship is consistently detrimental to a man's physiological health, the utility marriage provides a low-friction exit. This is a radical departure from the 1950s demographic that believed in staying for the kids or for the sake of appearances. The 2026 man views his peace of mind as his most valuable asset, and he has built a legal shield to protect it. Furthermore, we must look at the financial fidelity score. In 2026, many men are requiring their partners to maintain a specific credit score and asset-to-debt ratio as a condition of the domestic contract. This is the demographic response to the hidden debt crisis of the early 2020s. By auditing the financial health of the household in real time, men are preventing the demographic trap of walking away from a marriage with 50% of a debt they didn't create. This is clinical, it is cold, and it is the only way the 2026 man feels safe enough to participate in the domestic market. This leads us to the demographic of the contractual father. Unlike the weekend warriors of the 1990s, the 2026 man uses his utility contract to secure his parental rights from day one. He doesn't wait for a divorce to ask for 50-50 custody. He builds it into the marriage protocol. If the marriage ends, the custody schedule is already triggered, and the child support amounts are pre-calculated based on a sliding scale that accounts for inflation and career changes. This removal of the litigation threat allows the man to be a better father during the marriage because he isn't parentally insecure. He knows his place in his child's life is guaranteed by code and contract, not by the whim of a judge. The rise of the utility marriage is also reshaping the real estate and consumer markets. The 2026 man is increasingly purchasing homes with what are called dual primary suites. These are houses designed for the LAT living apart together. Demographic within a single structure. It allows for the intimacy of a marriage with the autonomy of a single life. This demographic of men is willing to invest in high-end architecture that reflects their need for personal space and asset separation. The traditional master bedroom is being replaced by the domestic executive suite, a reflection of the man's role as an autonomous manager of his own life. As we look at the historical trajectory, we see that we have moved from a demographic of men who were legally owned by their families, to men who were legally destroyed by their families, to men who are now legally independent of the traditional family definition. The 2026 man is a sovereign individual who happens to be in a partnership. He has traded the romantic dream for a manageable reality. He has audited his emotions, protected his assets, and secured his legacy. But as the 2026 man completes this transition, a final question remains. If every interaction is audited, if every commitment is contractual, and if every exit is pre-programmed, what happens to the human soul? Have we engineered the risk out of marriage only to find that we have engineered the meaning out of it as well? The data shows a demographic that is financially secure but spiritually searching. They have won the battle against the family court system. They are now facing a new kind of emptiness, the void of the perfectly optimized life. In the final part of our deep dive, part 10, we are going to look at the great synthesis. We will explore the emerging demographic of the neo-traditionalist men who are taking the hard-won legal protections of 2026 and trying to reintegrate them into a more soulful, communal way of living. We will look at the 150-year legacy of the American divorced man and ask, what is the ultimate potential outcome for the next century? Is it a world of cold contracts or a world of newly empowered families? The conclusion of the masterclass is about to reveal the final demographic blueprint for the American male. Are you ready for the summary of the future? Part 10 will tie every era together into one final vision of what it means to be a man in the United States history of tomorrow. The synthesis of the 150-year journey of the American divorced man leads us to a singular defining realization in the year 2026. We are witnessing the emergence of the neo-traditionalist. This is not a return to the 1950s, nor is it a continuation of the high-conflict era of the 1990s. Instead, it is a sophisticated integration of 2 centuries of hard-won lessons. The demographic of the 2026 man has taken the legal protections of the opt-out era, the technical precision of the utility marriage, and the communal support of the men's shed movement to build a new model of stability. To understand this final evolution, we must look at how the potential outcomes of this long historical arc are manifesting in the lives of men who are now choosing to engage with the domestic world on entirely new terms. Imagine a man named Benjamin in 2026. Benjamin is 34 years old, a professional in the renewable energy sector, and a father of 2. Benjamin's demographic profile is the great synthesis. When Benjamin entered his domestic partnership, he did not do so with the legal naivety of his grandfather in 1960, nor the defensive cynicism of his older brother in 2015. Benjamin utilized a 2026 smart prenuptial agreement that secured his premarital assets in a blockchain-verified trust. He established a co-parenting contingency plan before the children were born, and he maintains a strict separation between his personal wealth and the family's operational budget. But here is the critical difference. Benjamin uses these cold, clinical tools as a foundation for a warm traditional life. By removing the fear of total asset liquidation and parental erasure, Benjamin is able to be more emotionally present and traditionally committed than any generation of men before him. This is the demographic of the secure provider. Step by step, we can see how this synthesis is stabilizing the U.S. demographic map. Throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, the divorce rate for younger men was falling primarily because they were avoiding marriage. But in 2026, we are seeing the first uptick in marital filings in over a decade. However, these are not traditional marriages. They are private domestic unions. The historical trend shows that when men feel legally safe, they are more willing to invest in the social fabric of the nation. Benjamin and his peers are no longer looking for an exit. They are building structures where an exit is pre-negotiated and therefore less likely to be used as a weapon of conflict. This has led to a reduction in high-conflict litigation, which has traditionally been the primary driver of the demographic of the broken divorced man. The financial data from 2026 reflects this stabilization. For the first time in 60 years, the net worth of divorced men in the 35 to 45 age bracket is beginning to trend upward. This is due to the widespread adoption of the income shares model, combined with the 2026 Family Fairness Act's caps on legal fees. Case studies from states like Florida and Ohio, which were early adopters of 50-50 custody presumptions, show that when men are granted equal parenting time, they remain more productive in the workforce and are less likely to experience the career stagnation we analyzed in Part 3. The demographic of the deadbeat is being replaced by the demographic of the equal stakeholder. These men are contributing more to their children's education funds and local economies because their resources are not being drained by the multi-year litigation cycles that defined the 1990s. We must also analyze the shift in the social landscape. The friendship recession of the early 2020s sparked a massive cultural correction. By 2026, the demographic of the isolated man has transformed into the demographic of the tribal man. Benjamin doesn't just rely on his partner for social connection. He belongs to a local civic brotherhood, a modern evolution of the men's shed movement, where he participates in community service and mentorship. These organizations have become the new third places, providing the social safety net that was lost during the Great Divorce boom. This historical trend is vital because it proves that male autonomy does not have to mean male isolation. The 2026 man is sovereign in his legal and financial life, but he is deeply embedded in his communal life. The potential outcomes for the next generation, Gen Alpha, are being shaped by this synthesis right now. These children are the first to grow up in a world where divorce is no longer a catastrophic event of social and financial ruin, but a managed transition between two stable, sovereign households. The demographic data suggests that children raised under the 50-50 mandates of the 2026 Family Fairness Act show lower levels of anxiety and higher levels of academic achievement compared to the weekend warrior children of the 2000s. For the American man, this is the ultimate victory. The 150-year struggle to remain a father in the face of a changing social contract has reached a point of equilibrium. However, the legacy of the divorced man is not just about the future. It is a testament to the resilience of the male identity in the United States. From the phantom bachelors of 1870 who fled west to escape restrictive laws, to the Reno men of 1920 who bought their freedom, to the traumatized veterans of 1946, and the liquidated retirees of the 2010s, every generation of men played a role in pushing the legal and social machinery toward this 2026 synthesis. The demographic of the divorced man was the laboratory where the modern American social contract was tested and rewritten. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we see that the American man has moved from a position of fault to a position of formula. We have traded the drama of the courtroom for the precision of the contract. The history of divorce demographics in the U.S. is the story of a gender navigating the collapse of an old world and the slow, painful birth of a new one. In 2026, the man who walks into a lawyer's office, or more likely, opens an AI legal interface, is no longer a victim of a system he doesn't understand. He is an architect of his own destiny, using the data of the past to ensure the stability of his future. But the 2026 synthesis is just the beginning. As we look beyond the current year, a new question arises. What happens to the concept of the state itself when the family unit becomes entirely contractual? As men move their assets into digital realms and their domestic lives into private agreements, the state's role as the arbiter of social morality is fading. We are entering the era of the post-statist family. In our next deep dive series, we are going to explore the rise of the digital homestead. We will look at how the 2027 Global Tax Compact is attempting to chase the wealth of the sovereign man into the metaverse, and why the demographic of the nomadic father is becoming the biggest threat to traditional government revenue. The battle for your assets didn't end with the Family Fairness Act. It just moved to a different coordinate. Are you ready to see the next frontier of the male exit strategy? The data is already coming in, and the numbers are more radical than anything we have seen in the last 150 years. Stay tuned for our upcoming series, The Sovereign Economy.